Hello, Robs. We're back with Mars Without Venus, the study of some homosexual generals by Major General Frank M. Richardson, Dick's son. And I believe we're on chapter 7. I started this book probably 6 months ago, and then I never finished it. Part 1, chapter 7, part 1. Save, and then we shall open this. Mars without Venus. Or without Venus. Oh no, now we got 2 chats opening. As I said, this will be read in 2 sections. Come on, stop. And then we also turn on the volume. There we go. 2 popular idols. The heroes of this chapter, John Nicholson, the hero of Delhi, and Lawrence of Arabia. Whatever their other achievements, were assured of a place in their fellow countrymen's esteem in the days of our imperial expansion because of their ability to establish an unquestioned ascendancy over men of another race. I believe that this ascendancy was much less assured in the case of Lawrence than in that of Nicholson. T.E. Lawrence spared no pains in fostering his legend, and the aura of mystery which clung to his name even after his death. Many people, especially foreigners, believed that his death was faked, and they saw his finger in many a pie of Eastern intrigue. John Nicholson, I feel, would never have set himself to cultivate a spurious reputation. I feel he had too little respect for the opinions of others to bother about doing so. Neither of them deserves, as a soldier, to fall in beside some of the distinguished men described in previous chapters. John Nicholson, at the time of his death, was a brigadier general. Lawrence, never more than a colonel. Incredible though it may seem, Lawrence was compared favorably with Napoleon by no less a military pundit than Sir Basil Liddell Hart, who even seriously considered his claim to join the list of great captains. He concluded that Lawrence had developed a reasonable theory of war more profound than any of the great captains have revealed. Presumptuous though it may be, I have never felt quite the same about Sir Basil since reading that piece of monumental nonsense. And I must read the Wavell was very guarded about Lawrence's military qualities, but thought him capable of inspiring leadership and deeply read in matters of war. Lawrence shares with Napoleon only a birthday, 15th August, 1769 and 1888, an almost obsessional craving for hot baths and some sexual inclinations, though I suspect that he may have been a nicer human being than the emperor. Brigadier John Nicholson, 1821 to 1857. One of the great names of the Indian Mutiny, Nicholson is still spoken of and written about as a striking example of the military hero. Hesketh Pearson's biography of Nicholson includes a page of exceptionally high tributes from very distinguished military and civilian contemporaries. Further acquaintance unhappily reveals him as rather an evil man. He was the oldest son in an Irish doctor's family of 5 boys and 2 girls. He was endowed with many of the attributes of a born leader. He was tall, 6 feet 2 inches, burly, dark, and good-looking. He had absolute conviction of his own rightness and knew that he had been chosen by God for his great work. Even as a very young boy, he had a marked tendency to be an inordinately pious. In fact, a model of what Ahmed Abdullah and Pakenham aptly called objectionable moral exhibitionism. However, this trait may have impressed Victorians. He sounds like what today we would find an unbearable little prig. At a very early age, he announced his intention of fighting the devil, and he was always able to justify his actions, perhaps mainly to himself by biblical quotations. Writing of the floggings which he habitually ordered, he said, "We are told in the Bible that stripes shall be meted out according to faults." He never outlived his strong Puritan streak. His favorite reading was scriptural tracts, and he was almost as much addicted to quoting the scriptures as Gordon. Unhappily, it is one of the curious aspects of the Christian faith that the followers of the founder of their faith, who preached love for all men, have been driven by conviction of their own rightness. In the full fervor of their faith, indeed, in the name of Christ, to commit almost unbelievable bestialities upon those who happened to profess a different brand of the same faith. They have done this in the sincere belief that they were saving their souls and even those of their victims. John Nicholson's conduct recalled the excesses of the Inquisition. Not only we British, but the Indians too may do well to avert our eyes from much of the story of 1857, that year of tragic misunderstanding on both sides, from which we have made a remarkable recovery. To Victorian men, and especially to Victorian soldiers, whether married or not, their women were sacred objects of veneration, an attitude which has been somewhat eroded by the strident advocacy of women's liberation. To men the world over, the savage murder of children will always arouse strong emotion, even desire for revenge. The best known of all the terrible deeds of 1857 was the shooting down of all but a handful of the British soldiers in Cawnpore, and the subsequent slaughter of all their wives and children. It was an act of treachery, for they had been lured from their inadequately defended position by a promise of safe conduct. The mutinous sepoys refused to murder the women and children, and butchers had to be brought from the town. When the relieving force arrived just too late, the slaughterhouse was inches deep in blood, and women's hair, children's toys, and other pathetic relics were scattered around. The bodies, many still just living, had been thrown down a well. The reaction of our people at home and in India can be imagined. I repeat this oft-told tale as a background to John Nicholson's sadistic behavior. He personally administered both corporal and capital punishment and kept the heads of executed criminals on his desk. For the punishment of mutineers, blowing from guns and hanging, sometimes in the skins of cows or pigs to make the punishment more painful by outrage of religious feelings, were too humane for him. In letters and discussions, he advocated a range of foul and sadistic punishments and refinements of cruelty and executions, advocating torture and flaying alive, impalement or burning. He wrote, "I will not, if I can help it, see fiends of that stamp let off with a simple hanging. I would inflict the most excruciating tortures I could think of on them with a perfectly easy conscience." An admirer of John Nicholson pointed out that his cruel excess hardly equaled the gross cruelty of some Indian princes. Let's read the footnote before we move on. Even gardeners are not free from religious discrimination, a particularly malignant scourge known to us in Scotland as bishopweed becomes ground elder south of the border. One named Rumbir Singh lowered his brother by the hair into a cauldron of boiling oil, an inch a day until life was extinct. He then warned those who might rebel against him that they would be severely punished and not treated to the merciful death given to my brother. It ought to be mentioned, not in extenuation, but in an attempt to understand how any leader could behave as Nicholson did, that before the mutiny, 2 of his brothers had been murdered in India. John Nicholson had himself found the horribly mutilated body of his favorite younger brother, Alexander. Let it also be remembered that Nicholson did not stand alone in such excesses. General James Neal, punishing some of the perpetrators of the Cawnpore massacre, made men lick clean a square foot of the blood-stained floor of the massacre room before being hanged. This was an echo of an early story about Nicholson. A Pathan tribal chief spat on the ground near Nicholson's feet as a gesture of defiance and was forced by Nicholson to lick up the spittle. He was known thenceforth on the northwest frontier as Lick Spittle Khan. A little understanding of John Nicholson's sadistic tendencies may be afforded by consideration of a rather disturbing fact of sadism defined by Ivan Bloch, and so far as I'm aware by him alone. He called it tropical frenzy and saw it as affecting Europeans in official positions in tropical countries, exercising extensive powers greatly exceeding anything which they had experienced or could experience at home. It is a case of the corrupting influence of power, and Bloch thought that it was exacerbated by climatic conditions. At certain seasons, the climate of the plains of India can be inordinately trying to the temper. It almost seems to produce personality changes, altering for the worse the temperaments of normally placid individuals. Bloch wrote that this phenomenon had been responsible for the colonial scandals of every country. Paul Scott, in the last book of his Raj Quartet, amusingly, but as usual observantly, allows his hero Guy Perron to speculate upon the influence of the amoeba working in the bowels of the Raj on the conduct of the Europeans in India and upon Anglo-Indian history. Perron had become interested in the effects of tropical environment on temper and character, and I think he was certainly on the right lines here. Throughout his career, Nicholson exhibited what was described as an icy reserve, which repelled so many, and an awful sternness which knew no pity towards evildoers. I keep missing these footnotes. A division of the spoils. I believe that it was the amoeba, entamoeba histolytica, to be precise, and not cancer, which, acting upon his liver, killed Napoleon in St. Helena in 1821. He never smiled and had a cold, abrupt, and haughty manner which antagonized many people. He became intimate with no one and reserved all his love for his mother, to whom he was intently attached. Sir Henry Lawrence was the only man whose good opinion he desired, whom he admired wholeheartedly. It was said that he did not like India or the Indians. Yet, despite this and the defects in his character, he became and died a great leader of Indian troops, adored by his men, and that in more than the usual sense. Son of a bitch. Dusty ass book. Pardon. Some of his followers formed themselves into a religious sect, the Nicholsanes or Nicholsanus, who worshipped him as a god during his life and for many years after his death. Sir J.W.K. wrote that they remained utterly devoted even when he regularly whipped them. Nicholsanes, when separated from him, would come back regularly to receive whippings from their god in almost masochistic fervor. The head of the sick cult of Nicholsanes cut his throat when he heard of Nicholson's death. Life had become meaningless to him. Sir George Campbell, who knew about Nicholson's faults as well as his achievements and disliked the tendency to deify him, compared the stories about John Nicholson to the romantic songs invented generations later about that contemptible and drunken young man, Charles Stuart. There speaks a member of the clan most resolutely opposed to the Jacobite cause. Nicholson, like Gordon and Kitchener, was wedded to his profession and without any interest in women apart from his devotion to his mother. Like Gordon, he was shy, reticent, and very unsociable. But he was not shy in his military life. Indeed, a tendency to arrogance was the chief factor which caused a great many British officers to dislike him. Some disliked him on sight. That's fucking brilliant. Michael Edwards, the author of the most recent biography, sums up Nicholson, the Victorian hero, as a violent, manic figure, a homosexual bully, an extreme egotist who was pleased to affect a laconic indifference to danger. Nicholson was a homosexual, a repressed homosexual, disgusted by his own inclination, and one who translated his disgust into a violence manic in its manifestations. And I'm probably going to sneeze here again. No doubt his dedication to soldiering was fired by sublimation of his repressed sexual feelings, as similar dedication in many other men has probably been. But it is not really possible to condone his excesses, though it is possible to understand how the extraordinary pressures in 1857 could have led such a man to such inhuman conduct. It is certainly equally impossible to forgive the behavior of Nicholson's bête noire. I don't know how to say that first word. Bête, bête noire, the infamous Nana Sahib. For years he had been a trusted friend of the British, had entertained them and been entertained by them, as a loyal supporter of our regime. Yet it was he who organized the treacherous massacres at Cawnpore. It is, however, possible to have some insight into his motives. He was the adopted son of the Peshwa, and according to Indian laws and customs, he was fully entitled to succeed to his adopted father's title, his rights, and his pension. The British rulers of India refused to recognize his rights and thus made a powerful enemy. But the Nana Sahib, although a fairly influential and a venomous enemy, was only one enemy. Similar obtuseness about Indian customs and beliefs caused enemies to be made by lesser men, including army officers who adored their soldiers and their regiments and were genuinely incredulous when they found themselves being murdered. Whether later generations of men who ruled India would have bowed to unwritten laws and recognized the Nana Sahib as Peshwa, I cannot say, but British officers certainly came to understand Indian soldiers better. And fatal rifts were not allowed to develop from what were often trivial and avoidable misunderstandings. It seems quite possible that E.M. Forster, in A Passage to India, captured something of the climate of Anglo-Indian relations as it may have been in 1857, with the lack of rapport which led to such a tragic climax. But if one who first went to India 5 years after that world-famous novel was published may judge, Forster gravely misrepresented the attitude of most of the British in India during the first quarter of this century, and thereby did his country a grievous disservice. Mind you, this book was written in 1981. I will not pretend that we were faultless. On my first train journey in India, I shared a carriage with a seasoned sapper captain returning to his unit. When an Indian gentleman got into our carriage, my companion made me stand on the platform whilst he hunted unavailingly for alternative accommodation. He left us before nightfall, and I traveled on to Lucknow with my Indian fellow traveler, a truly charming country squire who chatted to me about my future life in his strange country. He smilingly and gently said that he had noticed my friend's reluctance to share a carriage with an Indian. We readily agreed that this was an attitude which it would be wise for both sides to forswear. Morgan Forster knew virtually nothing of British military or club life in India. He first went to India with a party of Cambridge friends who were unfavorably impressed on board ship by some Anglo-Indian acquaintances, especially a typical Mem Sahib of the Keep Them in Their Place Brigade. Forster's party were joined by a young British cavalry subaltern who happened to be a committed homosexual. You'll notice that they always, in this book, which I mean is trying to suggest that these people that he mentions, including Napoleon and Lawrence of Arabia, were homosexual, but they have zero evidence. Not that I care either way, but the book is almost just a gossip book. There's literally no proof of any of it. He invited Forster and his friends to stay with him at his regiment's station. There they were kindly and hospitably entertained, but it seems doubtful if they made a favorable impression on the heterosexual cavalrymen. The majority won hopes. To most British soldiers and civilians in India, the horse was the central feature of their life in that country. Morgan Forster's idea of getting on terms with a horse was to deliver a violent punch to its head. Jesus Christ. His life was lived predominantly with Indians. Do horses just accept that, or would they rage? His life was lived predominantly with Indians, from whom he must have absorbed his impressions of our presence in their country. He said himself, "It is odd that I should have seen so much of the side of life that is hidden from most English people." He was for a long time secretary to the Maharaja of Duas, a Maratha prince at whose court he was the only European. Whilst there, he was passionately attracted by some male palace servants, and finding his lust irrepressible, he sought the help of the Maharaja, who was sympathetic and understanding, although he was totally immune to homosexual urges, which he characteristically blamed on those damned Mohammedans. However, he procured for Forster the services of a palace barber whom he both paid and silenced. Forster's behavior, as described by his last biographer, P.N. Furbank, explains a reviewer's description of Forster as a furtive homosexual. Let's check out this footnote. The term Anglo-Indian is used in the sense in which Forster used it, and it was used by William Hickey and Thackeray, not as it is used today for a person of mixed blood. All right. If many British residents in India felt that Forster was not the best representative of our country, who would say that they were wrong? What a pity that his great literary gifts, which gained worldwide recognition and translation into many languages of his best-known novel, should have been used to present so biased a view of our record in India. If I seem to protest too much about all this, I do so because a balanced recognition of all that we did for India could be far more valuable for happy relations with the Indians and Pakistanis in our country than all the absurdities of what Peter Simple in the Daily Telegraph calls the race relations industry. Britain's economic growth. Point number 1, the envy of the race industrial world. 7th February 1979. It was, I think, fortunate partly for himself and certainly for the British cause in India that John Nicholson died at the zenith of his military glory. If any man would have increased the bitterness of the post-mutiny days, John Nicholson was that man. With his views on the punishment of the rebels, now seen as nationalist martyrs, he was assured of a hero's welcome in England. T. Rice Holmes, an early historian of the mutiny, wrote that at the age of 34 he had done enough to win for himself a place among the foremost heroes of Anglo-Indian history. Whilst recognizing the flaws in Nicholson's character, Holmes thought that these would have been eliminated by maturing experience. I hope, however, that I am right in feeling that his career would not have blossomed in India. Surely the influence of good men, trained in the Lawrence School of benevolent government would have suppressed the policies of men like Nicholson and Neil. That was not 12 pages, was it? No. All right, so how many pages is Lawrence of Arabia? There's Nicholson right there. There's Lawrence of Arabia. Damn, Lawrence of Arabia goes a long time. $134. That's 18 pages. How far is it to there? $17. Where does this end at? 19 more pages. I'm not reading that many. All right. Now I am going to stop here because that makes sense. We've done it with every other one. We'll do it now. We'll do it live.